All right, PAX Aus Online 2021. Welcome, welcome. It's such a pleasure to be with you. I'm so honored that you would take an hour out of your amazing virtual PAX to be here with us at this panel. We're going to make it worth your while. We wish we could be with you all in the fine city of Melbourne in person, but this is going to be fun too. Let me introduce us to you quickly. My name's Aaron Suduko. I'm the founder and chief video game analyst of With a Terrible Fate. I am here with my exceptional friends and colleagues, Richard Nguyen, Max Gorinsky, and Camus Ducharme. For those of you who don't know, With a Terrible Fate is an online volunteer publication dedicated to studying and analyzing the storytelling of video games. That's the one thing we do just because we love these stories so much and we want to better understand them and give all gamers the tools to better understand them and build a new language around what makes their storytelling so great. We mostly work in long form written articles, which you can find at withaterriblefate.com. But the other thing we love to do is come out to conventions like this, share what makes these stories so great with like-minded gamers, and have awesome conversations with you. So excited to have some of those over the next 2 days with first this panel and then another panel tomorrow, which I hope you also check out. A couple of housekeeping things, just because this is an online PAX and a little bit different. First of all, we're going to be taking advantage of the Discord functionality to chat with you all after the panel once our presentation is done. So we're going to be talking at you about this topic for about an hour. I hope you pay attention because we put a lot of time into putting together our thoughts to share with you. But afterwards, we would love just as much to hear your own thoughts on the topic of ethics in video game storytelling or anything related. So please come find us and hang out in the appropriate channel of PAX's Discord server afterwards. We're similarly going to be taking advantage of the Discord server to actually warn you about spoilers. So we are talking about a few somewhat recent games in this analysis. If you want to get the gist or general idea of the presentation but don't want those games spoiled for you, we're going to let you know ahead of time when we're going to start talking about them. And then we're actually going to let you know in the chat in Discord once those spoilers are over. So if you want to check out and avoid spoilers for a game and jump back in, it's totally within your power to do that. We won't be offended. In fact, we hope you do. Right. Finally, we're going to be taking advantage of this fine online format with some QR codes. So we've had the benefit of doing this kind of analysis of video game storytelling for over 6 years at this point, amazingly. So we've actually developed a library, not unlike the one you see behind my good buddy Richard, of analyses of various kinds of video game storytelling and our favorite games. So when we have relevant things to bring into the conversation, we're actually going to have QR codes that you can scan. If you want to learn more, it'll link you to articles about the same topics. So with that in mind, let's dive in and think about what ethics can do to video game storytelling. Of course, before we can get to that point, we need to raise the question of what ethics is in general, right? It's a term that's thrown around a lot. I come from philosophy, and so that's going to be motivating how we think about it today. And really, we don't have to go any deeper than just this notion that in certain situations, given a particular actor, there are permissible ways for that actor to act, impermissible ways, and sometimes things that are required of them, right? This is what we think of when we talk about moral obligations. And the study of ethics is basically the question of, okay, what do those obligations or rights or permissions consist in, and where do they come from, right? Which is why we get people like these fine old folk like Aristotle and Kant and John Stuart Mill arguing for different theories of basically what goodness consists in with regard to actions and how we can determine what we need to do in any given situation. Now, that's a very general study of how to live one's life, but we can also think about it in terms of our favorite video games and their stories, right? This term ethics in gaming, I think it has kind of a negative connotation because oftentimes as modern gamers who love the genre, when we hear something like this or morality in gaming, we've been indoctrinated with the idea that either someone is going to be talking about how games like Call of Duty cause people to be violent, which I hope we can all agree is very silly and unfounded, or with admittedly very simplistic morality choice systems like the things you get in Mass Effect, which, while they might be really fun, I think after a certain point, to many gamers, feel like a little bit of artifice or something that's maybe not as natural, that's superimposed over a game's world just to make it feel a little more dynamic, but is ultimately not that substantive, right? We want to do something different. Like I told you, we are all about thinking about what makes games special as a storytelling medium. You can think about games in a ton of different ways, but that's what With a Terrible Fate focuses on. So we're going to be thinking about the literary value of ethics. Some of the greatest books and films and other works of storytelling of all time have been great precisely because they present interesting ethical questions or dilemmas that you wouldn't encounter in the real world, but that can actually enrich your understanding of what ethics consist in, both within literature and within your own life, right? And teach you in many ways how to be a good person. So that's what we're going to be asking of our favorite games. How can they present ethics in a new way that can get gamers excited about this moral dimension of their stories and their own lives? We're going to be thinking about it in 4 ways, right? First, course, we're going to be starting with a couple considerations of how ethics in gaming can actually give you new ways to think about moral behavior in your own lives, right? Beginning with Richard, who will think about how more sophisticated choice systems than you would get in something like the Renegade Paragon paradigm of Mass Effect can give you mental models for thinking about the ethical choices that you have to encounter in the real world. Then we're going to flip the script on that, and Camus is going to talk about virtually the opposite side of that coin, saying when games artificially constrict the choices available to you, how can that actually guide and change your perspective on moral decision making in the real world? Then we're going to turn to the more literary aspect of it. My friend Max is going to present a really cool taxonomy of different ways of thinking about the ethical paradigms of your favorite video game stories, so we can get a little more theoretical background to what we're talking about. And then finally, I'm going to suggest to you how video games, by virtue of being a uniquely interactive medium, can integrate the audience into the ethical conversation in a way that other media, such as novels and films, cannot, and can present uniquely interesting storytelling content through that lens. This might seem a little esoteric right now, but as the Triforce on the screen alludes, I think you'll find as you reflect on it that this ethical dimension is intrinsic to many of your own favorite games. And so hopefully, if nothing else, you'll take away from this conversation a way of thinking about your favorite games that maybe lets you get something out of them you might never have thought of before. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Richard to get us going. Let's jump in.
Fantastic. Let me start sharing my screen. Great. Sorry. Awesome. So for as long as we can remember, the media has portrayed video games as the enemy. You've all seen those sensational headlines. They ask, are video games making children more violent or aggressive? Even Donald Trump and his administration, in a meeting with Congress and ESRB, actually pointed to moments like the No Russian mission in Modern Warfare 2, where you're put into position of a potentially mass shooter at this airport here, as concerning evidence that video games can lead to violence, aggression, and said mass shootings, when decades of studies have actually consistently shown the opposite. Today, we want to shift the question to something that's a lot more interesting and productive. Instead of questioning whether games are making us worse, how are games actually making us better people? And yes, that includes even the most violent ones, like Modern Warfare 2 or The Last of Us Part 2, which is being covered by my colleague after this. Why can't video games receive the same level of analysis and benefit of the doubt that many other art forms, like Schindler's List or John Wick, that contain these mature themes of acts and violence actually do? By the end of this section, I want us to come away equipped with the examples and the language to express to even people like our parents that all those hours of gaming really did teach us how to be good, moral people. And to move on to the next slide here, let's begin by examining the infamous game series that helped to actually popularize the morality system that we like to call the moral binary. In this game, they brand it the karma system, which still comes down to choosing whether you want to make good or evil choices. This ultimately determines your character's identity as superhero or supervillain. Note that blue and red refer to good and bad, respectively. I blended in the word red and blue there. And even the decisions themselves use loaded words such as to redeem versus corrupt Eugene, or save versus betray humanity. In theory, these are challenging situations to be in, but if you've already been playing the game up to this point, your decision has already been predetermined based on whether you want your avatar to be the superhero or the supervillain. By the end of the game, it doesn't ever really make sense to mix and match. So the moral binary and what you see is pretty much what you get. It presents good and bad morality in the very simplest sense, but not necessarily in a realistic or subtle way. In these two examples you see on the screen alone, you'll see that morality is designed to be obvious and kind of idiot-proof, so much so that it's hard-coded into the game design. So what's missing? Well, first off, there is really no middle, and there is no gray. That doesn't necessarily have to be in the form of a third middle option, but there's really no room for the player to critically think about the two decisions presented before them. The game does all the thinking for you, and it's essentially made it easy for you to default to whichever moral pathway you've committed yourself to from the beginning of the game. Again, it doesn't really make sense to add on to both the Paragon and Renegade meters when you could easily maximize one of the two. Then there's just been how we've been socialized. When you hardcode the moral binary to broadly predefine moral archetypes or theories such as good or bad, Paragon, Renegade, good or evil, you get player behavior that skews heavily towards the easy way out. The good playthrough, or the path of least resistance, because it's the way that most people want to see or think of themselves, and it validates how we've been socialized to behave. Statistically, this actually results in 92% of Mass Effect players choosing Paragon choices at any given moment. And even throwing back to our case study on the infamous series, each game sequel in that series defaulted to the good karma ending as canon, because 70 to 80% of players opted for good karma playthroughs anyways. It isn't surprising to see that a vast majority of players in both cases have trended towards the good decisions and moral binaries, when the good is so clearly defined as such, and even hard-coded by a blue color. And even though these renegade and evil decisions are cool and interesting, they're typically the exception to the rule. They're fun experiments in being the villain or the asshole, rather than truly reflective narrative pathways. This leads to a phenomenon we've identified as the gamification of morality. There comes a point when your moral decision-making system is so neat, so clean, so clearly defined, that it strips away any true mental distress or cognitive burden or thinking on the players themselves. Instead of challenging and testing the boundaries of the player's moral compass, it kind of merely affirms it, or even worse, kind of provokes nothing at all. On the left-hand side, you see that Bioshock, with the decision of whether or not to harvest or rescue these little sisters, can come close to provoking some moral dilemma for the player. But by repetition, it ends up being not too dissimilar from the moral binary we see in Infamous. On the right-hand side, and even though it looks like a child's drawing, I want to talk about the famous moral trolley problem, with its own moral binary dilemma, but gets across what many moral systems in gaming kind of lack. So imagine, if you will, you're that guy in the middle operating a lever that's controlling the track direction for a train that's already on the way to killing 5 people tied up down the tracks. You see this, and you realize you have 2 options. Option A, you can pull the lever to divert the train away from those 5 people, but you'd be allowing the one person tied up on the top end of the tracks to be killed instead. Or B, you could do nothing and allow the train to continue as planned towards killing the original 5 people, but you will have had no agency or intervene on the situation. And what immediately strikes me about this binary as compared to Bioshock or Infamous is that it kind of stops you in your tracks, doesn't it? And that's, yes, the pun is intended there. There's no real predetermined value or judgment assigned to either option A or B. It's not hard-coded by a red or blue color, or in this case, I guess, red or blue tracks. Or there's no really strong suggestive wording. Both decisions are pretty gray. Will I feel guilty by my inaction, or would I rather feel guilty by actively choosing to kill this other poor sap, even if I want to save 4 of the people in the process? There's a reason why this moral trolley problem has been a go-to staple across psychology and philosophy experiments to provoke a moral reaction and thought process out of a person. There's something crucial here that I wish more games had. It makes you uncomfortable, no matter what you choose. And it's in that discomfort where you learn more about yourself and where your moral compass actually points. So what makes us as gamers uncomfortable? And thinking about all those times decision-making in games have left that kind of impression on me, I've hit on 2 common ingredients. The first is ambiguity, where even in the binary, it's unclear where either decision lands on the moral spectrum. When your options don't neatly align to broadly predefined categories, such as good or bad, you don't know which you'd fall back on, so you're forced to critically think how these stack up against your own values and objectives. In other words, it's put on you, the player, to decide. That's why we've referenced this moment in Red Dead Redemption when you hunt down this pitiful Sasquatch on the right-hand side screenshot here, who ends up being the last of their kind. And he asks you to kill him to end his suffering. You can let the Sasquatch live and take no action, but you still be leaving him to suffer in his own pain. Or you can end his suffering as he's requested, but you now be guilty of murder. This aligns closer to the moral trolley problem we discussed earlier, where there's always some bad with the good, and the answers aren't so easy. The second ingredient is unpredictability. It's every gamer's nightmare not to know how the world or gameplay systems are going to respond to your inputs and actions at every given moment. That's why these systems and trackers like the Paragon Renegade system in Mass Effect or the Karma system in Infamous exist. They're designed to be predictable, quantitative, and measurable as a way to empower the player to take charge over their own moral progress. But we know that isn't quite how the real world works, and it assumes that there's this global common understanding of good and bad, when we as humans know that's actually kind of far removed from reality. So let's look at this decision in Red Dead Redemption once more. Where you kill the Sasquatch or not, there is no external force coming to judge you or hold you accountable for your actions. You're left to wonder and sit with the decision on your own, which is arguably more powerful because your mind and imagination can go very far. Maybe the Sasquatch will kill himself anyways, or end up turning into the very monster you feared because his sorrow turned to anger and a Darth Vader-esque plot twist. Maybe there really were others of his kind out there somewhere that came looking for him. In playing God, you've altered the world in ways that are unpredictable, and you're made to wonder about these consequences because there is no objective feedback given to you. So let's talk about these gameplay systems and how they've actually gone forward in helping make players uncomfortable, and good examples that in these two celebrated games here, The Witcher 3 and Telltale's The Walking Dead, have done for me. Let's start with how they achieved a better level of ambiguity in the decisions you make from moment to moment. First, you can see from the way your options are presented to you in the interface that moral definitions and values aren't hard-coded by a color or position along a dialogue wheel. You see that these are either lists or these circles of dialogue options are unranked and untiered. So you want to look at all of them before deciding to give them equal consideration, as opposed to always choosing the blue option in the upper right corner of the wheel to maximize your good moral playthrough, as you would say in Mass Effect. Second, having more than two options helps to represent a wider spectrum or a variety of responses beyond a good or evil binary. There's actually room to color shades of gray and deliver nuance to the moral dilemma, especially in the tone and language used to respond, such as in The Walking Dead there, where there are two different ways to let Kenny make his decision, or two different ways to stop him. Third, and it's also shown in the right corner, screenshot there with a time limit, that games can actually impose a limit on how long you can take to respond. This actually mirrors and improves upon the dilemma we face in the moral trolley problem. In that thought experiment, in a doodle and a little paragraph, you're led to believe that only you can pull the lever because the train is moving fast and you're the only one close enough to take action in time. But in practice, you have all the time in the world to think on it. And some decisions in The Walking Dead and The Witcher, and this is actually the advantage video games, you really only have a matter of seconds, like in many crucial moral decisions in real life, to decide. You can't sleep on it and reflect on how to best optimize your moral self. And then finally, in real life, bad deeds can often go unpunished and good deeds go unrewarded. And it's that sense of unpredictability that The Witcher 3 and The Walking Dead often achieve in response when players do make their moral decisions. This kind of payoff moves beyond your typical immediate feedback loop of a reward and a punishment over every decision you make that's tracked. You won't get that linear EXP boost or moral meter tracker shift left and right each time you perform a good or bad thing, because that's not how it works in real life. Instead, you're subject to very less logical, more emotional, and ambiguous responses that vary based on character personalities, values, and beliefs. On the right screenshot there, Clementine witnessed what you did. And that look of fear on her face is a narrative response to your decision. It's not necessarily meaning that you did something good or bad, it's that you did something that affected her. Neither of these games that we show here have a global sense of morality. There are no clear trackers or categories. Instead, it's based on your interpretation of your own actions and how characters with their own distinct values respond to you. Ultimately, that's how we get to a more realistic simulation of moral decision making. It's going to be relative in the eye of the beholder. How the Baron on the left-hand side there ends up in The Witcher 3 is going to be tragic no matter how you slice it. But can you live with the role you played in leading him down that road? This Witcher 3 questline, without spoiling it, wants you to question and ponder your own moral self, rather than offering you easy answers and a clear-cut good or evil ending. And to wrap this all up, here are a few high-level takeaways that I encourage both players and even game designers to embrace when designing gameplay stories and mechanics. First, mature themes and violence can be employed to achieve more than just shock value and sensational headlines. They are truly extreme, complicated situations that test the boundaries of our own ethical and moral values. Then within these moral dilemmas is that essential feeling of discomfort. Discomfort leads to growth and self-reflection because it's what we as humans are wired to remember and re-examine to survive in the future. And finally, there's two ingredients of discomfort are ambiguity and unpredictability. The more we embrace these feelings in moment-to-moment gameplay, the more we can push ourselves to be better and more nuanced selves. And if you want to read more, here's a QR code where you can take a screenshot or to read more into the moral binary in a long-winded article I wrote for their site earlier. But thank you so much, and I'll hand it off to my next colleague.
Thank you, Richard. That's a great segue into my topic because I want to focus on a specific example of that type of discomfort leading to growth. But the example I want to focus on is one in which there is no choice for the player. Today, I want to explore what The Last of Us Part 2 can teach us about personal responsibility. So before we go into this, this is your one spoiler warning for The Last of Us Part 2, and by extension, The Last of Us. The case I want to focus on is a very contentious moment in the discourse surrounding The Last of Us Part 2, and that's the moment when Ellie tortures Nora. This moment is very interesting for our purposes because it forces the player to participate in this torture via the inclusion of button prompts. And as a result, it raises a lot of questions. First and foremost is who is responsible for the torture of Nora? Is it Ellie? Is it the player? Is it the developer? We're going to explore that question and see what we can discover. And also, we're going to ask how this scene and the way it's structured affects our view of personal responsibility in our real world decisions. So those are the questions I want you to think about as we go through this presentation. But first, we should examine this from each of the people involved. Let's start with Ellie. Ellie, of course, is the avatar. And her goal in this situation is to see Nora punished because she helped in killing Joel. And in the moment, she does this by actually performing the torture. Now, behind Ellie, we have the player. The player is observing and controlling her. And their motive in doing so is to help Ellie get revenge for Joel's murder. Most players will come from playing The Last of Us Part 1, and they've established this connection with Joel throughout the countless hours they've played that game. So they want to see Ellie get revenge. But at the same time, they don't necessarily want to see her go to such extreme lengths. Maybe they say that for Abby, who actually killed Joel, but Nora, someone who is tangentially related, they don't necessarily want to see her brutalized and tortured for her relationship to Joel's murder. But the most important piece for the player is that they participate in this torture via the included button prompts, which we'll explore subsequently. And then behind the player, we have the developer. The developer is observing and manipulating the player with the goal of making them contemplate their role and their agency in this situation and how their actions play a role in this moment of the game. And to that end, they've constructed this scene which forces both Ellie and the player to partake in torture. Now, for our purposes, the developer discussion is a lot more secondary. So we're going to focus more on the relationship between Ellie and the player when it comes to personal responsibility in this moment. So let's focus first on this removal of choice. If you look at the picture on the left, you'll see that there is a very tiny little white circle, and that right there is a button prompt that the developers deliberately included in what is otherwise a cutscene. This removal of choice is very important, first and foremost, because it forces the player to confront an action that they hopefully would not commit otherwise. And as a result, it creates the very sort of discomfort that Richard talked about in his presentation. Specifically, it creates what's called cognitive dissonance. For those who are unfamiliar, cognitive dissonance is the idea that somebody's thoughts do not align with their actions, and as a result, there's a mental conflict. We see that happen in this moment of The Last of Us Part 2, where the player, again, wants to see Ellie get revenge, but doesn't want to see her torture somebody who is tangentially related. But at the same time, the game forces them to essentially give the order for Ellie to torture Nora. So there's this disconnect between the player's thoughts and their actions, which leaves them very uncomfortable. From a narrative perspective, this removal of choice is very important because it reflects Ellie's current mindset. She believes that she has no other option to move forward. Joel got killed, and she only can go get revenge by killing everyone who helped murder him. So we have this interesting reflection of the narrative in the gameplay mechanics. So let's focus more on the nuance of this button prompt. Specifically, I want to explain why I'm calling it a button prompt, because a lot of people might be inclined to call this a QuickTime event or a QTE. I disagree, because a QuickTime event is characterized by a fail state. If you don't press the right button in the right amount of time, you have to start all over. It's a game over. In this case, it's not a QuickTime event. The button prompt comes on, it stays there, and there's no fail state. You can sit there and wait as long as you want. The game will sit there and wait with you. And as a result, it gets the player to really think about what they're about to do. So it's distinctly different from a QuickTime event. And that's why I refer to it differently. But what's most interesting about this button prompt is that it straddles the line between gameplay and cutscene. Specifically, the player comes into this moment of the game. They've hunted down Nora. They've chased her down. She's run away. And then it shifts into a cutscene. So the player goes in the mindset, okay, we're in a cutscene. Ellie's going to take control and do what she does for the narrative. I set down my controller and let's watch what happens. But then out of nowhere, that button prompt comes on, and the player, expecting cutscenes, is surprised to see, oh, am I supposed to participate here? And as a result, they really think about what's going to happen when I press that button. So they sit there, they think about it, and then no other option is available. They press the button, and Ellie takes a metal pipe and smacks it right over Nora's face. And the player is shocked. Oh, I wasn't expecting that. I thought Ellie was going to do that, not me. And then the button prompt comes up again. And now the player, knowing what is going to happen here, is rightfully concerned. I have to do this again. So they have to press it again. No other choice. And then Ellie takes another swing. And then a third time. The game forces them to participate and really just absorb themselves in this moment. And it's brutal. And as a result of this button prompt and this inclusion, it divides responsibility between Ellie and the player. Whereas the player expected Ellie to bear responsibility for these actions, to be the sole agent involved. Now, because of this button prompt, the player has to accept some responsibility, or at least grapple with their role in this moment, because they gave the order in the same way that a superior in, say, the military would be responsible for the orders that they have their subordinates carry out. To illustrate how important this is, let's look at a comparison that I'm sure many fans of The Last of Us Part 2 will be familiar with, and that's the ending of The Last of Us Part 1. This moment where Joel storms the Firefly base to save Ellie from being killed is very similar to the one we see in Last of Us Part 2. It's structured in a very similar way, but it's different in that it's all gameplay. There is a forced choice where the player has to kill the main surgeon who stands in their way from saving Ellie, but at the same time, they can choose what they want to do with the other people in the room. And what's interesting about this moment is that because it's gameplay, the player is in a completely different mindset from when they're playing The Last of Us Part 2. They spend the last half hour of the game hunting down and brutally slaughtering all the Fireflies that are trying to prevent them from saving Ellie. And the player has no problem because they're in a gameplay mindset, which in most games is I have to kill the enemies and progress forward. So they come to this surgical room, and the head surgeon pulls out his scalpel and says, I'm not letting you pass. And the player sees that's another enemy standing in my way from saving Ellie, who I've spent this entire game growing to love. Well, you're getting out of the way, pal. Sorry about that. So they just go up, they dispose of him, they take Ellie and they run. They get her out of there. And what's interesting about this is that the player, despite doing something which is similarly brutal to the torture that Ellie commits, has no problem accepting responsibility. And that's because they understand that I am in gameplay, I am in control, anything I do is my responsibility. So they have no issue accepting that responsibility. There is no discomfort in this moment. Now, that's a very big contrast to The Last of Us Part 2, because in that moment, the player is very reluctant, almost aversive to accepting responsibility, because, again, they went into that moment with a different mindset and were not expecting to be participating in this torture. And this reluctance to accept blame is key to what we want to take away from The Last of Us Part 2. And it's important because that's something that The Last of Us Part 2 is really dealing with on a fundamental narrative level. I mean, we even look at this moment from a narrative perspective. Ellie doesn't want to accept responsibility for actually torturing Nora. She wants to put blame on Abby. Abby killed Joel. I wouldn't be here if Abby didn't kill Joel. So it's not my fault that Nora got killed. It's Abby's fault. And we, the player, we see that and we think, come on, Ellie, that's a little absurd. You had the choice to torture Nora or not, and you chose to do it. What's interesting, though, is that we, the player, after going through this scene, are doing the same thing. We think, I didn't have a choice. The game gave me no choice, and so I had to participate in this torture. So it's not my fault. It's really Ellie's fault. She was the one that actually did it. But like we think about with Ellie in terms of the narrative, we are doing the same thing. We're shifting that responsibility, that blame for this action onto someone other than ourselves, despite the observable reality that we did participate in it. And it's uncomfortable. But the biggest takeaway of this parody is that in real life, we often feel like we don't have a choice. And as a result, we want to blame outside forces, just like we do in this moment. So what The Last of Us Part 2 is trying to get us to realize, it's wanting us to think about our agency, even if we feel like we might not have any. We do, and our actions have consequences, and we have to accept responsibility for those actions and acknowledge our agency in making these choices. And it does that by establishing this parity between Ellie and the player and forcing them to participate in this torture. So the major takeaways that I want all of you listeners and the people watching this presentation to understand is that, first and foremost, by removing player choice, The Last of Us Part 2 forced the player to think more profoundly about what they are doing in the game and what role they as an agent play in the game's world. And in doing that, it succeeded in doing that by incorporating minimal interactivity through the button prompts that we explored. And through those button prompts, it forced the player to accept responsibility for an action that they otherwise were not going to accept any responsibility for. And all of this was done for the primary purpose of getting the player to recognize that although it's easier to, give up that responsibility, abdicate that personal responsibility for those actions, we have to acknowledge that we did play a role, that we do have agency, both in the game and in the real world. So that's the more personal takeaway here, that even though we might not want to acknowledge that we maybe did something that had some bad consequences, that we have to recognize that we did make that decision and accept responsibility for what happened afterwards. And with that, I'll turn it over to Max.
Thank you very, very much, Camus. And a big hello to all of you at PAX this year, and a particularly warm welcome back to all of you who were present during last year's Magic the Gathering and JRPGs panel. Right, let's talk taxonomies, let's talk definitions, let's talk ethical classes in gaming. So we've analyzed at some length now a few of examples of games that make very intensive incorporations of ethical content, but let's look at some of the separate ways in which different games actually go about doing this. So one of the ways that games establish these ethical stakes and ethical classes is through mechanical ethics, which is mainly what we've been looking at so far. So mechanical ethics are ethics that are technical, they're tied into the performance of the game. They are either in the form of quantified ethics in terms of a morality meter, like in Mass Effect or in Knights of the Old Republic, which you can see on the top right, or otherwise these ethics are manifest in the way that they determine narrative paths down which a player is led in the course of a game developing, as is very famously the case in Undertale, which you can see on the bottom right. And there's a second kind of ethical class, which is incidental ethics. So whereas mechanical ethics are involved with determining gameplay outcomes through ethics, incidental ethics are ethics that are entirely superfluous. They have a basis only in narrative and in flavor. That doesn't mean that they can't make an impact on us. That simply means that they operate outside of the actual mechanics of the game itself. We can see this, for example, in Majora's Mask, where there are an extensive number of ethical side plots or ethics-based side plots that the gamer can engross themselves in order to more to better experience the world of the game, but they don't have any direct bearing on the outcome of the game itself, at least in terms of the main story. So in terms of these two ethical classes, we're going to talk about two games today, and thankfully we will stay mercifully spoiler-free in this section of the presentation, so you can all stay right in your seats. The first game that we're going to look at is a game very close to my heart and our heart here at With a Terrible Fate, EarthBound, a paragon, of incidental ethics. So the ethics of EarthBound are almost entirely incidental, and there's a lot of incidental ethical content in there. We see it in the abuses that are meted out to the minced children, which obviously do have some bearing on the outcome of the narrative, but not on the mechanics of the narrative. We see Jeff and Ness coping with absentee fathers, either comically or tragicomically. We see police brutality, we see juvenile delinquency, we see backstreet arms dealers who, however affable some of them may or may not be, are all committing deeds that, were we to transpose the ethical incidents themselves into more of a sobering, realistic context, we'd find considerably more, I suppose, thought-provoking or concern-provoking than we do in the context of a pastel-colored, vaguely satiric JRPG like EarthBound. So we see here in these kinds of incidentally ethical games, ethics that are expressed through superfluity. So we see that these ethical concerns, while they don't have any direct bearing on gaming outcomes, they're ambient and they're decorative in nature. They come through in dialogue. They come through in our general sense of the feel of the world in which the game evolves. They do shade our experience of procedures within the game. They just don't affect them. They assert themselves to us in many ways, only when we actually stop to think about them, only when we stop to think, how would we think about these particular events were they to occur outside of the conditioned context of a very whimsical play-oriented environment like the one that we're in when we play EarthBound at Happy Happy Village, a town of virulent cultdom. Early in the game is a very good example of that. Anyone who's familiar with EarthBound will know exactly what I'm talking about. So it's a question that we can then ask ourselves is, what role do ethics that aren't actually geared towards gaming outcomes serve in the course of conditioning our experience of those games? Well, the answer to that question is incidental ethics have a world building function. Instead of determining the path that we actually go down in the game, it colors the way that we think about the world itself that we are playing these games in. It serves a world building function. We can therefore say that instead of being a procedural device that actually affects the way that these games work out, these ethics are more of an artistic device. They give depth and flavor, to use that word again, to the overall experience, despite the fact that the progression of the game itself is very linear along ethical lines in the way that Camus has just spoken about with respect to The Last of Us Part 1. The actual basic ethic of EarthBound is very straightforward. You are the hero. Your heroism is more or less impossible to pervert by any choice that you can make in the game. You will proceed along those lines. It's only when we stop to consider the surrounding context of EarthBound that we understand that this game does have particular ethical dimensions to it, if not per se ethical stakes. And I would certainly argue that this ambient ethical component, these incidental ethics, are the reason why EarthBound carries a particular pronounced fear of dread, of a kind of creepiness that you don't normally associate with these kinds of disciplines. If you were to look at the game without playing it, you would get a very different impression than the one that you do actually get when you are journeying through the game's world itself. So we can see from that the incidental ethics, even when they don't determine gaming outcomes, still have a very pronounced effect on the way that we feel for a game. And anyone who's interested to learn a little bit more about how this happens, or to dig deeper into EarthBound and its many, many virtues of all kinds, feel free to activate that QR code right there, and you can find your way to the comprehensive theory that we're still in the process of building. Will shortly reach its conclusion. How it's going to conclude, who knows? No crying till the end. But yeah, I hope that you, some of you, take the time to delve into that. So game number 2 that we're going to look at is considerably less famous in the annals of gaming than EarthBound. It's a game called This War of Mine, which was developed for the PC by a Polish gaming development house. So having looked at incidental ethics in that incidental mechanical dichotomy, the obvious thing for us to now do would be to look at a game that was mechanically ethical. However, my illustrious forebears in this presentation have already done that at great length. So I think something that would be more worth our while to do at this point is to look at a game that essays an even more difficult task than just trying to be credibly incidentally ethical, or to create a cogent and engaging mechanically ethical gameplay mechanism, which is a game that manages to combine both of those schemes. Now, it's not just as simple as having a mechanically ethical game with a game that, or rather with a narrative that has incidentally ethical components. This War of Mine, as we're going to explore now, it does something a little bit deeper, does something a little bit different, does something more complex and more satisfying in the way that it combines the incidentally ethical and the mechanically ethical. So I'll give you a quick summary of the game itself. Again, it will be spoiler free for all those of you who aren't aware of the game itself. It's basically The Sims in Sarajevo. You take control of a party of civilians in a wartime scenario. You spend the day in your decrepit house trying to get things to work. Very basic amenities. You need to keep your party alive, clothed, fed, and in a state of reasonable comfort. And you then spend the night scavenging in various locations in this war-torn cityscape in which the game unfolds, hoping to find things that are going to make your survival a little bit easier. It is a mechanically ethical game. There are instances where you will make ethical decisions that will affect gameplay outcomes, but it has a twist. Unlike games with a morality meter, the incidental ethics, or rather the mechanical ethics of This War of Mine, are not linked to a traditional reward system whereby either our kind of ghoulish sense of villainy or our sense of moral righteousness is engaged by one of the decisions we make, even if those senses are engaged in a subtle way, in ways that escape that basic moral binary that Richard was talking about. And I think the key to this is the fact that this war of mine is entirely passive in its gameplay. It's based not on winning, it's based on surviving from day to day and for an indefinite period. And what we see that this does is it gives players few means to avoid ethical conundrums like the one that you can see in the screenshot on the right. And it is a common occurrence within the game that you may find characters petitioning you for help, and you have to make a real serious decision, ethical and practical, as to whether you can afford to do that. And one of the ways that this war of mine does this, and the way that it really joins together incidental and mechanical ethics in quite a devastating package, is through the use of emotion as an ethical compass and making that into a gameplay dynamic. You can see here that you get very detailed readouts of your character's conditions, very much including their emotional states. So we see in this war of mine that avatars' ability to perform in-game is affected by their emotional states. It's not just affected by their HP, there is no HP scale as such, by their level of health, by their level of fedness, or the fact that whether or not they've rested in recent times. It's very much determined by how they feel. And this creates a sense of what I'm going to call ludic distress in the players, where our enjoyment is impaired because our characters feel bad and they can't perform properly. So that gives an immediate sense of mechanical ethics to the game. The way that you cause characters to behave may cause them to feel morally indignant at themselves, and that will cause your own experience of the game to become complicated. It will cause your experience to become more difficult. You will encounter obstacles that you might not have had purely otherwise. But what this does is, because we are then forced into the shoes of our character, because we're forced to share a distress of our own that comes from their distress, this obliges a kind of empathy, a very direct kind of empathy that is further magnified by the incidental surrounds, which are the setting in which the game occurs, the very realistic depiction of civilians trying to survive under wartime. So we see the way in which emotion marries the mechanically ethical to the incidentally ethical. Now, we know that games are resource intensive. Most games make their fun for us by being resource intensive, whether that's because we're chasing technical machines or whether it's because we're chasing experience points or anything that's expendable within the game, any kind of currency, the coin of the realm that allows us to become more competent at playing within the game's particular dynamics. We know that. That's, as I say, in most games. Few of them, however, use resources to uphold basic fundamental aspects of our human equilibrium, like mental health or our physical health, our wellness, our ability to function in the most basic of ways. This war of mine does that, and it does that through the means of trade-offs. It actually instantiates a system of ethical exchanges, which again really hits home this combined ethics idea. So in the course of a successful playthrough of this war of mine, you will almost inevitably have to perpetrate an action that you as a player, or certainly your characters as characters, will come to feel regret for. However, there's also the likelihood that within the game's matrix, that you will also be the beneficiary of great generosity. It's not one-dimensional in the sense that it's a game that tries to, again, using that word ghoulishly, tries to put you in moral conundrums that you can't resolve, but you will have to countenance bargaining patterns like we can see on the right here. So my party's hungry, is not very well, is not in a great state of health. Can I afford to agree to help our neighbor? Can I afford to help these children? Maybe the best option for us to do would be to go out in the game's in-game evening and rob this defenseless old couple living uptown. But if you do that, then all of a sudden you'll be plunged again into that state of ludic distress, because your player characters will be outraged by this and their performance will drop. So this kind of non-stop ethical decision-making, this kind of intensively mechanical ethic, then combines with this very hard-coded sense of obligation of empathy, of forcing of empathy, even for players who are able to dissociate from the emotional components of this, as I say, very, very realistic game that already obliges a tremendous degree of association from the player to their avatars. It all amounts to a very, I can only describe it as soul brutalizing theater of combined ethics. And it really does demonstrate the degree to which the different ethical classes of gaming can be combined to pretty horrendous effect. I think this war of mine is probably one of the great games that's been made that can often be described as unenjoyable, but certainly no less certainly no less high in quality for that. And with that, I turn us back over to our illustrious El Capitan to take us home.
Oh, my friends, we've already been on quite a journey, and I hope it's made obvious at this point that any impulse that you or people to whom you speak to turn away from the notion of morality in gaming is ill-founded, and there's actually quite a lot to explore here. So far, we've seen really, really challenging ways of deepening our own understanding of our moral agency in the real world through games. And now with Max, the notion of how games can be more literary by integrating ethics along these two different dimensions of the mechanical and the incidental. Now, what I'm going to do in our remaining time is to put those two things together and say, all right, given that games are an interactive medium, how can we involve the player directly in their stories such that part of the literary value of video games ethics consists precisely in the role that the player is occupying? And along the way, we might just have the chance to talk a little bit about my favorite shinobi, but we'll get to that. It starts with a pretty intuitive question. Simply, given that I'm playing this game and it's interactive and I seem to be doing more in it than I do when I'm reading a book or watching a film, how exactly do I as the player fit in? And given that I'm involved in some way, what do I owe to this fiction and to its constituents, such as its characters? From that simple intuition and question, I'm going to walk you through first what seems like the most intuitive answer, then an answer that seems perhaps less obvious, but I actually favor more in terms of an understanding of the player's fundamental role in video game fictions. We're going to see how this different understanding actually unlocks a new dimension to how we can understand ethical storytelling within games and really reflect differently just on what it is for us to play a game. We're going to look at Sekiro, Shadows Die Twice, as I alluded to in that capacity, and then finally take a step back so that if you are interested in thinking about the ethics of your favorite games in this different dimension, you can actually have a little bit of a roadmap to how to do that. So it's not just a presentation in the abstract, but a blueprint for getting something different out of your own favorite games. Here's the obvious answer to this question of our involvement in a video game story, right? It's pretty intuitive to suppose that that just consists in the role that the avatar is playing, right? Especially when so many games such as Dishonored, pictured here, give you the perspective of the avatar on this world as if you were seeing it through, in this case, Corvo's eyes as Emily takes his hand in the world of Dunwall. It's easy to suppose that whatever the player's ethical obligations consist in are just identical with the avatar's ethical obligations, so that to make your decisions in the game, similar to what Camus was talking about in The Last of Us Part 2, you're actually putting yourself in the avatar's mindset and determining what is best to do or what is available as a live option based on the avatar's place in this world. That's very natural, but I actually think when you reflect on the theoretical commitments that one has when one takes that position, there are some pretty serious challenges to it. I'm not going to go through those challenges now. I'm actually going to be talking about this in a little more depth in our presentation tomorrow, so feel free to check that out if you want to. There's also a link to a journal article I've written more in depth on the subject here, so scan that sweet QR code if you're interested. But for the purposes of our conversation now, I want to just gesture at what my preferred view consists in and show you how, if you buy into that view or at least want to take it for a test drive, it lets you see a different dimension of your favorite video game stories. Instead of thinking about yourself, the player, as just occupying the role of the avatar through the worlds of these video game fictions, I instead prefer to think of the player as this more metaphysically foundational kind of entity, similar to a god, this kind of figure who acts upon a world from the outside and has the unique ability to make possible events within it actual, not unlike this iconic representation in the creation of Adam by Michelangelo on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, where God is basically making man possible through his agency from the outside. Right? I think that when we think about the player's agency in this way, we can actually come to understand what she's doing in video game stories as related to, but importantly, distinct from the avatar, able to do more godlike things while following along the avatar, similar to what you would get in the concept of point of view in something like a novel or a film. Now, this is conceptually interesting for our purposes because once we think of the player as not just occupying the role of the avatar, but rather occupying the role of this godlike entity that I call the fictional player, you get new ethical questions that don't really have a parallel elsewhere. And I'm going to show you why by using the closest parallel I can think of, which are Old Testament Bible stories. I hope you all brushed up on your Bible literature before coming to PAX, because why wouldn't you? But there are stories in the Old Testament where God is very involved in the events on earth, where he seems to do what might be some morally suspect things if he were anyone other than God, right? My favorite example is the book of Job, right? Where God basically doesn't have faith in the faith of Job, someone who follows God and worships him and does all the right things. And so God, sitting up in his clouds, all skeptical, says, you know what I'll do? I'll test Job's faith by ruining his life and taking away everything that he cares about. And of course, because it's the Bible, right? Job remains faithful even as like every aspect of his life is ruined by God. Now, because this is the Bible, it's not really even meaningful or indeed coherent to ask the question, was God morally justified in testing Job in this way? Because in the context of the Bible, the concept of the moral good basically emanates from God. It's an instance of what in philosophy we call divine command theory, where the question of what is right and wrong is basically exhausted by whatever God commands, right? So we can't really evaluate the ethics of God's actions in a meaningful way. But when we have the player occupying this similarly godlike role in a video game, we can ask those kinds of questions meaningfully to say, given that the player is this entity with this agency to do things that are beyond the ken of anyone within this world and to affect the characters in those worlds in radically meaningful ways, what does this kind of entity, this fictional player, owe to those worlds and its characters? And it's questions like that that I think unlock a new dimension for ethical thinking within the literature of games such as Sekiro, which I want to think about for a little while with you now. For those of you who don't know, Sekiro Shadows Die Twice is, as of the publication of this presentation, the latest of Hidetaka Miyazaki's works. He's the brilliant madman behind things like Dark Souls, Bloodborne, Armored Core. And people lauded this game rightly because it has a really overt and interesting and intimate, indeed, character-driven focus that many of his games, at least superficially, don't seem to. I want to show you how, thinking about it through this lens of the fictional player, we can not only come to appreciate those characters, but also the player as this kind of unnatural entity who owes them different things and can, in fact, affect their fates in pretty radical and challenging ways. So with that, I'm going to give you a spoiler warning for Sekiro. We're going to explore its story for a little bit before zooming back to the big picture of where this leaves us. The principal players in Sekiro, and there are a lot of interesting characters, but at core, I think it's mostly focused on this intimate relationship between this young lord named Kuro, whom you see on the middle of the screen here, and his retainer, the shinobi Wolf, otherwise known as Sekiro, whom you see on the right side of your screen. Now, Kuro has been chosen as not the first, but the latest to bear the dragon's heritage. There's this divine dragon, whom you see on the left side of the screen, who's basically this kind of metaphysical existential interloper who comes from the west of Japan and has arrived in Japan and basically selects these mortals to bear his bloodline, thereby making them immortal. And so Kuro has what some might consider a gift, some do consider a gift, but he considers the curse of immortality. He finds it deeply unnatural and antithetical to what it is to lead a human life. And he wants Wolf to help him find a way to sever this bloodline and free him from the influence of the divine dragon, right? Wolf, we find, also bears some interesting powers, like the ability to revive after death, per the name of the game, because of his relationship with Kuro, and by extension, the relationship with the divine dragon. And so in very broad strokes, the story of Sekiro Shadows Die Twice is Wolf's journey to come to understand what this divine dragon's heritage consists in, what he owes to Kuro, what he owes to the other people in his life, and figure out the best way to end the story, so to speak. Right now, because it's a video game, these aren't, of course, the only main players in it. There is, of course, the player, right? And so it's natural to ask the question we started this part of the presentation off with. Okay, how is the player related to the world of this video game? And given that, what does she owe to this world and to its characters? Again, it's a natural first impulse to think that because Wolf is the avatar, the player's agency just consists in whatever Wolf is doing. But even looking at these figures on the screen, and given what I've told you so far, I hope you can notice something interesting that's going on besides that, which is the player, this external entity that has this kind of unusual metaphysical agency to make things happen in this world and explore it in this video game way that is not bound by the way that ordinary people exist within in the world and navigate it. It's kind of similar to the divine dragon in terms of coming from elsewhere, imposing herself upon the world, and having these gifts to bestow, such as quasi-immortality to the avatar, the one who has been selected to bear the burden of carrying out the player's will, right? And so in this little image of the various players in the central drama that is Sekiro, we have this interesting mirror of what's going on with the divine dragon and what's going on with the player, right? The player imposes her will unidirectionally on Wolf in the same way that the divine dragon imposes its will unidirectionally on Kuro, right? And so while Kuro and Sekiro are relating to each other and developing this relationship that goes beyond that of mere lord and retainer to really come to know each other and owe things to one another, there is in the outskirts of this kind of metaphysical agency being imposed upon them that they have to figure out how to wrestle with as they are undergoing these more human journeys at the same time. And given this kind of relationship between the divine dragon, who is in fact an enemy and antagonist in the game, and the player who is doing something kind of weirdly similar, it's right to ask yourself, I think, well, okay, what do I owe to this world that is saying something about my ability to impose my will on it from the inside, from the outside, is powerful yet unnatural, right? Because even as the player is able to revive Wolf and help him along his journey and give him abilities that no one else in this world could possibly have because of his relationship with the player as Avatar, there are consequences to that, kind of metaphysically wretched consequences, because as Wolf navigates the world and avails himself of the player's powers, things like dragon rot happen, this wonderfully named disease where as Wolf continually revives himself in this unnatural way, in fact, other characters in this world will come down with this disease that limits their functions and capacity to act, making you feel as though there's something unnatural and perhaps even perverse about the player being able to impose her agency in this way. This agency that all of the antagonists in the game, like Genichiro Ashina and Owl, pictured on the left and right-hand side of the screen, seem to try to acquire for their own ends, their own antagonistic ends of mere dominance and power, right? So even as you are engaging with this game for seemingly altruistic purposes, there's this deep undercurrent that what you are doing is maybe not right, and you as the player, as this godlike entity, are the only one in a position to come to terms with that, right? That gives you an interesting new way of thinking about the endings of Sekiro, because in the abstract, when you're just thinking about Wolf's choices, the 4 endings to the game can feel like a bit of a smorgasbord of various options that aren't deeply related to each other, right? But if instead you are thinking of it as the player, this metaphysically foundational godlike figure coming to terms with her own power and its consequences and coming to decide, given that, what she owes the world, they become a little more logical in terms of the conceptual space that they lay out for different ways in which this narrative can end, right? There's the Shura ending, in which case the player basically says, this agency is too much for me to handle, and so I'm simply going to give up. And so you see Wolf go off the rails, taken over merely by his bloodlust, no longer guided by this kind of metaphysically external sentience. Or similar to many themes in Miyazaki's works, such as Dark Souls, you can merely endorse the cycle and say, yes, there's something unnatural about my agency, but that's just part of what this particular worldview consists in, and so I'm continuing to exert it as you sacrifice Kuro to free him from the dragon's heritage, only for it to be implied that the dragon will choose someone else to carry on with the cycle, much as you carry on with New Game Plus sequences in this and other worlds. You can instead say, look, I've come to recognize the value of the intimacy that Wolf has with Kuro. I'm going to say that Kuro's life as the character in this story takes precedence over everything else, and in fact go through the motions to sacrifice your own avatar and conduit to this world in order to save Kuro's life, save him from the dragon's heritage, and give him the opportunity at a normal life. Or in the most intricate and perhaps compelling ending, you can say, look, I recognize there is something deeply unnatural and almost hegemonic about my powers that I am imposing upon this world. And so I'm going to go radically out of my way in order to take the dragon's heritage away from Japan, return it to the West, and use this world's own resources in order to restore its natural order and basically step away as the player with this unusual agency from the world. In the abstract, when you're just thinking about Wolf, very hard to make sense of those 4 scenarios. But I think thinking about it as the choices available to this kind of unusual and unnatural god, you can see more clearly the overall trajectory of this story. And I encourage you to think about your own favorite stories in this way. It might seem like an unusual way to think about what the player is up to in game stories, but I think when you start with just simple questions like, okay, what are the abilities of the avatar in this world? What are my own abilities as a player, and how might those overlap but also diverge from the avatar? And given that, are our interests the same? Are they different? To the extent that they diverge, what might that be saying about my own agency as a player, and also what this overall story is trying to convey, not just in the avatar's path, but also in terms of the role of this kind of unnatural player agency in the world? You can come to understand a new layer to the ethical literature of your favorite video game stories without thereby devaluing the ethical path of the avatar or anything that we've discussed prior to this part of the conversation, because of course those ethical considerations for Wolf and other avatars also consist in part of the video game story. It's just not exhaustive of the ethical dimensions available for us to consider. Right. So with that, I hope we've given you some interesting moral content to consider in your favorite games, or at least to encourage people to think more rigorously about the ethics of video games beyond those misconceptions we started out with. Beyond all that, I want to thank you for listening. We're going to hang out with you in Discord now. If you want to check out any aspect of this conversation or add your own voice to what we're talking about, hope you check out our other panel tomorrow, which is all about different methods to interpret and metagame stories. It'll be at the same time, but I think in a different virtual room. And as always, check out withaterriblefate.com if you'd like to dig into any of our other analyses. Thank you so much. You're the reason that we do this, and I hope you have a great rest of your virtual PAX Australia.